Okay, let's get started. Round 2 then. All right, so we're going to look at the denouement of Othello, and it's a stunning speech. Some of you say you've done it before. I hope that I can give you some new lenses and insights. I think that it's one of the greatest things that Shakespeare ever wrote. And the key thing to think about in terms of tragedy is Othello has, we've seen, killed this remarkable, amazing woman, Desdemona. He's done so cruelly. She's begged for mercy. He's become a fool in Act 3, hasn't he? He's become like a stooge. In many ways, he kind of parallels Rodrigo. So there's this very difficult task Shakespeare has of trying to make him into a tragic hero. And one of the people who writes very well about this, I don't like everything that A.C. Bradley writes, but he talks about the role of poetry in Othello. And he talks about Othello as a kind of romantic style poet, you know, someone who is so beautiful in his speech. We know that one of the reasons why we're so alienated from Othello is when he loses his speech, as I say. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is that Othello loses all of his poetry. We know that he loses his meter in Act 3, doesn't he? His meter turns into prose. It becomes incredibly fragmented. All the zoomorphism comes, the goats and monkeys, the crudity of the language. We saw earlier, didn't we, that Iago says to his wife, "It is a common thing." Well, we see that Othello starts to speak in the same way. And of course, that alienates us from him. And we see him in some ways, as I say, as a dolt, as a gull, as a fool, like Rodrigo. But by the end, in this particular scene, we've had the catastrophe. Now we have this incredible moment of anagnonesis, and we have to decide what it does for us. Now, first of all, it's important that we realize that what happens here is that Othello reminds us of his stature. Now, if we're looking for the Aristotelian thing, we know that, the tragic hero must be a man of stature, must be a man of rank. This would contrast very much with Streetcar. So when you're writing about Streetcar, you're going to write within the 20th century paradigm of the tragedy of the common man, which is a very famous paper by Arthur Miller. And in it, Miller says that in the 20th century, the Aristotelian conception is dead. In Shakespeare's day, it's very, very much alive. And we know that in some ways, Othello has reduced himself into some kind of laughing stock. In Act 5, Scene 2, we are reminded of what man he is. Now, before he speaks with anger, he speaks without rhythm, he speaks with abusive tones, and now his poetry returns. Incidentally, if we're looking to link, the actual murder itself is absolutely stunning. The moment before he kills Desdemona, when he reflects upon the nature of life and Promethean heat, etc., which is where Frankenstein comes from, of course. It's a beautiful and stunning speech. So we've got the full return of Othello's eloquence. Now, what does Shakespeare do? When we have Othello's eloquence, we have Iago's silence. I'm sure you all notice that. For much of the play, Iago is the great artistic genius. He is the dramatist who writes the play, isn't he? And he actually delights in it. He talks about his monstrous, his child. He likens himself to a kind of parent stroke author. Of course, the Greek word author means father. So he sees himself as kind of siring, as kind of giving birth to this extraordinary piece of theatre. And it is remarkable. And for much of the play, Iago is the most exciting character. He has a kind of energy to his speech, which is absolutely remarkable, isn't it? A kind of Machiavellian energy, poeticness. And we see that Othello's eloquence dies, especially in Act 3. Well, I think Shakespeare is very clever to silence Iago, and he basically shoves him aside in the play, doesn't he? He takes his words away, and that allows Othello to come to the center as our tragic hero. And look how beautiful this line is. Soft to you, a word or two before I go. Here we have Othello, completely calm again, resigned to his fate. He's already decided that he's going to kill himself, but instead of speaking with rage now, he has a kind of resolution and calm. I have done the state some service, and they know. Now this is a beautiful understatement, hasn't he? Because one of the things about Othello to remember is that he literally is the guardian of the Christian world. Ironically, as a former, do I use the term Oriental or African or Muslim or whatever you want to use, as a cultural other, he has a kind of bizarre status in the Christian West, doesn't he? As the great general. And Cyprus, was a territory that was incredibly fought over. It basically has incredible geographical significance as a place where the Islamic and Christian world battled for dominance, etc. So let's not forget, Othello's role is extraordinary in his society. And he says, no more of that. So it's a nice, discreet... we're told earlier by Iago that Othello is so arrogant, so much hubris, etc. Here we don't see that at all, do we? He simply mentions it in order to get some time. And he basically wants to deliver his kind of funeral speech. Whereas Desdemona had the Willow Song, which really is in many ways quite incoherent, hard to understand, more like she's given up on language and resorted to song. Here, Othello returns to the genius of his poetry, and he speaks so beautifully. He says, when you shall these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am. So he asks for fairness, doesn't he? Now, there's a lot of debate about this. The feminist critic Claire Kinney, her name is, she does a fantastic course on Audible, which I'll try and record for you and put on Teams. She says that she can't stand him. That rather than talking about Desdemona, his last words are to try and exonerate himself and to get pity for himself. I think that that's very, very harsh. And what I like is the way that he uses beautiful symmetry and antithesis in his poetry now. Then must you speak of one that loved not wisely, but too well. I think that's a beautiful line. It's one of the best lines in the play. You have to decide whether you think that's true, whether you think that that's delusionary. If you were taking a kind of feminist view, you might find that really angry in many ways, yeah? Of not one easily jealous, well, you might question that. But being wrought, perplexed in the extreme. Well, I think there's some truth in that. One of the things that Shakespeare has done in Othello is to create the greatest villain in literature. That's what Harold Bloom calls him, the greatest villain in literature. And I think he probably is. He has a kind of demonic genius, doesn't he, Iago? And he seems to have, the dark spirits on his side with his timing and everything. There's a kind of superhuman quality to him, which is why it's always very interesting to consider whether he seems like a real character or more like an archetype of literature, a figure like Vice, who has almost demonic powers. I tend to see him more like that myself. And he did cause Othello to become perplexed in the extreme, of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away.